rusted key pressed against her palm like a frozen accusation. Maren Ashford sat alone in the driver's seat of a battered 2008 Honda Civic, her breath fogging the cracked windshield as October rain hammered the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. She was 18 years old. She had been 18 for exactly 6 hours. And in those 6 hours, every single thing she had ever believed about her life had been systematically dismantled and thrown into the gutter. Through the rain-streaked rear window, she watched the grand facade of the Ashford estate shrink into the darkness behind her. The mansion's warm lights glowed like mocking eyes through the downpour, illuminating the pristine hedgerows and the circular driveway where her entire childhood had just been packed into 3 black garbage bags and hurled onto the wet concrete. Her mother's final words still echoed in her skull, sharp as shattered glass. "Don't come back until you're ready to obey." Maren's fingers tightened around the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The heater in the old Honda barely worked, pushing lukewarm air against her trembling hands, while the rest of her body shook with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had $42 in her checking account, half a tank of gas, and absolutely nowhere to go. The tears came then, silent and hot, cutting tracks down her cheeks as she pulled the car to the side of the road and let the engine idle. She couldn't drive like this. She could barely see. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw, like a knife wound that hadn't yet begun to bleed. 6 hours ago, she had woken up believing she was loved. 6 hours ago, she had been a daughter. Now she was nothing but a problem that had been efficiently disposed of, a line item that had been crossed off a balance sheet, a tool that had outlived its usefulness the moment it refused to perform its function. The memory of the morning crashed over her like a wave of ice water, and Maren pressed her forehead against the cold steering wheel, letting the images replay in agonizing detail. There had been no birthday cake. She had noticed that first walking into the expansive granite kitchen of the Connecticut mansion she had called home for her entire life. No balloons, no wrapped presents, no smell of her favorite breakfast cooking on the professional-grade stovetop. Instead, the kitchen island had been cleared of everything except a single stack of legal documents and a heavy silver pen. Her mother, Cordelia Ashford, had been waiting for her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Cordelia was a striking woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled auburn hair and the kind of bone structure that photographers loved. She wore a cream-colored cashmere cardigan that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her manicured fingers were wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed gently in the morning light. "Happy birthday, darling." Cordelia's voice had been warm, almost musical. 18. Such an important milestone. Maren had approached the island cautiously, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers. Something about the scene felt wrong, like a movie set that had been arranged too carefully. "Where's Dad?" "Your father is in his study. He'll join us in a moment." Cordelia had gestured toward the documents with an elegant wave of her hand. "But first we need to take care of some paperwork. Just a formality, really. Now that you're legally an adult, there are certain assets that need to be properly transferred." Maren had picked up the first page, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. The words "quit claim deed" had jumped out at her, followed by a property address in Blackwood, Maine. Her grandfather's house, the house that Silas Thornwood had left to her in his will, held in trust until her 18th birthday. "What is this?" Cordelia's smile had tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's nothing complicated, darling. Just a simple transfer of that old property in Maine. Your grandfather's estate. You remember the place, don't you? That crumbling eyesore he refused to sell." Maren remembered. She remembered the smell of brass polish and lavender. She remembered sitting on dusty floorboards while her grandfather showed her the intricate gears of antique pocket watches. She remembered his wild white hair and oil-stained hands and the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. She remembered the way her mother had always spoken about him with barely concealed contempt. A lunatic, a hoarder, a failure who preferred the company of mechanical trinkets over respectable society. Silas Thornwood had died 4 years ago when Maren was 14. He had been her mother's father, but Cordelia had not cried at the funeral. She had stood at the graveside in a black designer dress, checking her phone while the minister spoke, and Maren had felt something cold settle in her chest that had never quite gone away. "You want me to sign away grandfather's house?" Cordelia's composure had flickered for just a fraction of a second. "We want you to transfer the property to the family trust, darling. It's the sensible thing to do." That old place is worthless anyway, just a patch of dirt and a rotting Victorian money pit. Your father and I have found an investor who's willing to take it off our hands, and we need the capital for the business. The business, Ashford Global Logistics. The company that had funded Marin's private school education, her designer clothes, her European summer vacations. The company that bore her family's name in chrome letters on buildings across 3 continents. But something in her mother's voice had sounded wrong. There was an edge to it, a desperate undertone that Marin had never heard before. And when her father had finally emerged from his study to join them in the kitchen, she had understood why. Preston Ashford looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. His usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled, and his hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't look at Marin directly. He couldn't seem to meet her eyes at all. "Just sign the papers, Marin." His voice was flat, exhausted. "Don't make this difficult." Marin had felt the first stirrings of real alarm then. She had never seen her father like this. Preston Ashford was a man who commanded boardrooms, who made decisions worth millions without breaking a sweat, who had built an empire through sheer force of will. But the man standing in front of her now looked broken, defeated, afraid. "What's going on?" Marin had asked, her voice rising. "What aren't you telling me?" Her mother's mask had slipped further. "Nothing is going on. We simply need you to sign these documents. It's a routine legal matter." But Marin's eyes had drifted past her mother's shoulder through the open door of her father's study, and there scattered across his mahogany desk in plain view she had seen them. Envelopes with red stamps, official letterheads bearing the seal of the Internal Revenue Service. Words like "final notice" and "immediate action required" visible even from across the room. The company is in trouble. Marin's words had fallen into the kitchen like stones into still water. That's why you need the property. You're not just selling grandfather's house. You're trying to liquidate everything you can. Cordelia's beautiful face had transformed in an instant. The warmth vanished like frost in sunlight, replaced by something cold and hard and utterly unfamiliar. The pretense of maternal affection had dropped away, revealing the calculating businesswoman beneath. "You ungrateful little fool." Her mother's voice had turned to ice. "Do you have any idea what we've sacrificed for you? The schools, the clothes, the opportunities. And now, when we need one simple signature, you dare to question us." "I want to read the documents first." Marin had been surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I want to see the property. Grandfather left it to me for a reason." That had been the spark that ignited the explosion. Cordelia Ashford had erupted with a fury that Marin had never witnessed before. 18 years of carefully maintained composure had shattered in an instant, revealing a woman consumed by desperation and rage. She had screamed about ingratitude and selfishness and the astronomical cost of raising a child who couldn't even perform a simple task when asked. She had hurled accusations like weapons, each one designed to wound, to break, to force compliance through sheer emotional devastation. And when screaming hadn't worked, when Marin had stood her ground with tears streaming down her face but her jaw set in stubborn refusal, Cordelia had turned to her husband with eyes like chips of obsidian. "Get her out." Her mother's voice had dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than the screaming. "If she won't sign, she's no longer part of this family. Get her out of my house." Preston Ashford had not argued. He had not defended his daughter. He had simply nodded, walked to the front closet, and retrieved 3 large black garbage bags. Marin had watched in disbelief as her father climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She had heard the sounds of drawers being yanked open, of clothes being shoved carelessly into plastic, of 18 years of accumulated possessions being reduced to trash in a matter of minutes. When he returned, his arms full of bulging bags, he still couldn't meet her eyes. "You have the Honda." His voice had been barely audible. "The title is in your name." The memory fractured as a truck roared past on the rain-slicked highway, its headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the tears on Marin's face. She lifted her head from the steering wheel and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks. Her eyes were swollen and red. She looked like a stranger. But beneath the shock and the grief, something else was beginning to stir. A small, cold flame of anger that flickered in the pit of her stomach and refused to go out. They had kicked her out on her 18th birthday specifically because it was her 18th birthday. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated. On this day, she gained legal access to her grandfather's estate. On this day, she became capable of signing away her inheritance. They had been waiting for this, planning for this, counting down the days until she was old enough to be useful to them. And when she had refused to play her assigned role, they had discarded her without a second thought. Marin's hand moved to her pocket, and her fingers closed around the object that had been pressing against her thigh throughout the entire drive. She pulled it out and held it up to the dim glow of the dashboard lights. It was a key, an old-fashioned skeleton key made of heavy iron, its surface pitted with rust and age. She had stolen it from her mother's desk drawer 2 years ago, hidden in a box of old photographs that Cordelia never looked at. Marin had recognized it immediately from her childhood visits to Maine. It was the key to her grandfather's front door. At the time, she hadn't known why she'd taken it. Some instinct, some whisper of intuition had told her to slip it into her pocket and never mention it to anyone. Now, holding it in her trembling hand, she understood. Silas Thornwood had known. Somehow impossibly, her grandfather had known that this day would come. He had left her the house in Maine for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with sentimental value or family legacy. There was something in that house, something her parents wanted badly enough to throw their own daughter into the street to obtain. Marin looked at the key for a long moment. Then she looked at the gas gauge. Half a tank. Maybe enough to get her somewhere warm for the night, to find a cheap motel where she could curl up and cry and figure out what to do next. Or maybe enough to get her to Maine. The decision crystallized in her mind with sudden, absolute clarity. Her parents wanted that property. They were desperate for it, which meant that whatever was sitting on that supposedly worthless patch of dirt was the key to everything. Marin put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway heading north. She wasn't running away anymore. She was going to claim what was hers. The drive took 14 hours. Marin pushed through the night, stopping only once at a desolate truck stop off Interstate 95 to buy a stale cup of coffee and a sleeve of generic saltine crackers. She didn't have money for a motel, and she was too wired to sleep anyway. The anger burning in her chest kept her awake, kept her focused, kept her foot pressed against the accelerator as the miles rolled by beneath her wheels. The rain followed her north, turning to sleet as she crossed into Massachusetts, and then to heavy wet snow as she entered Maine. The Honda's wipers struggled against the onslaught, squeaking and shuddering with each pass across the windshield. The heater gave up entirely somewhere around Portland, leaving Marin to drive with her winter coat wrapped tight around her shoulders and her breath misting in the freezing air. As dawn broke over the Maine coastline, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale gold, the memories began to surface. She was 10 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floorboards of her grandfather's workshop. The room smelled of machine oil and brass polish, and weak autumn sunlight filtered through grimy windows to illuminate the hundreds of clocks that lined the walls. Grandfather clocks and cuckoo clocks and delicate mantelpieces, all of them ticking in a symphony of mechanical heartbeats. Silas Thornwood knelt beside her, his wild white hair haloed by the light, his weathered hands cradling a small brass pocket watch. The back was open, revealing the intricate maze of gears and springs within. "You see these?" His voice had been soft, almost reverent. "Each one of these tiny pieces has a purpose. The mainspring stores the energy. The escapement releases it in measured doses. The balance wheel keeps time. Remove any single piece and the whole mechanism fails." Marin had leaned closer, fascinated. "How do you know which piece does what?" "Experience." Silas had smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Impatience. A clockmaker learns to see the whole by understanding the parts. But here's the real secret, little bird." He had lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "People are a lot like clocks. Most folks only care about the polished face on the outside. They see the pretty numbers and the elegant hands, and they think they understand what they're looking at. But the truth of a machine is in its gears. If the inside is rotten, warped, or missing pieces, eventually, it's going to stop telling the truth." Marin had thought about that for a long moment, her young mind working through the implications. How do you know if someone's gears are broken? You watch them carefully. Silas had set the pocket watch aside and taken her small hands in his large calloused ones. You pay attention not to what they say, but to what they do. Words are just the face of the clock. Marin, actions are the gears. The memory faded as Marin turned off the main highway onto a narrow country road. According to the gas station map she had purchased back in Connecticut, Blackwood was a small coastal town about 20 miles from here. Her grandfather's property sat at the end of a dead-end road called Hollow Oak Drive overlooking the rocky Maine coastline. She had been here only a handful of times as a child, always over her mother's objections. Cordelia had hated these visits, had complained bitterly about the long drive and the primitive accommodations and the eccentric old man who preferred tinkering with broken timepieces to attending proper social functions. But Marin's father had insisted, at least in the early years. Family is family, he had said. The child should know her grandfather. Looking back now, Marin wondered if even those visits had been calculated. Perhaps Preston had been maintaining the relationship for precisely this purpose, keeping the connection alive so that Marin would inherit the property when Silas died. Perhaps the whole thing had been a long-term investment, a chess move planned decades in advance. The thought made her stomach turn. The last 5 miles to Hollow Oak Drive were torture. The road had devolved from cracked asphalt to gravel to rutted dirt, and the Honda protested every bump and pothole with groans of mechanical distress. Dense pine trees pressed in from both sides, their branches heavy with wet snow, blocking out what little daylight managed to penetrate the overcast ski. The forest felt ancient and hostile, as if it was trying to swallow the road entirely. And then suddenly the trees fell away, and Marin saw it. The house stood at the end of the road like a monument to decay. It was a Victorian structure, 2 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and a peaked roof crowned by a weathered copper cupola. Once it must have been beautiful. Now it looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Dark ivy had colonized the entire facade, its thick vines snaking up the walls and across the windows like grasping fingers. The white paint had blistered and peeled, revealing gray weathered wood beneath. Several shutters hung at crooked angles, and the front porch sagged dangerously in the middle, its support beams rotted through by decades of coastal weather. Marin pulled the Honda to a stop at the edge of the overgrown circular driveway and killed the engine. For a long moment, she simply sat there, staring at the house through the frost-rimmed windshield. This was what her parents were desperate to obtain, this crumbling wreck of a building on a remote stretch of Maine coastline, surrounded by nothing but pine forest and rocky shore. It didn't make sense. There had to be something here, something hidden, something valuable enough to justify tearing a family apart. She got out of the car. The silence hit her first. After 14 hours of engine noise and highway traffic, the absolute quiet of the woods was almost disorienting. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the pine needles and the distant crash of waves against the unseen shore. No bird song, no human voices. Nothing but the weight of solitude pressing down from all sides. Her sneakers crunched loudly on the dead leaves as she approached the house. The front steps creaked ominously under her weight, and she had to grip the rusted railing to keep her balance on the rotted boards. But she made it to the front door without falling through, and she stood there for a moment catching her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door was massive, heavy oak darkened with age, fitted with a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. And in the center, a large iron keyhole that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Marin pulled the rusted skeleton key from her pocket. Her hand trembled as she slid it into the lock. The mechanism was stiff, frozen with age and disuse, and she had to grip the key with both hands and twist with all her strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a harsh metallic clack that echoed through the silent woods, the deadbolt gave way. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Dust and mold, and something else beneath it, something older, a mixture of brass polish and dried lavender that transported her instantly back to her childhood. The scent of her grandfather's workshop, the scent of memory. Marin stepped inside. The grand foyer was exactly as she remembered it, and yet completely transformed by 4 years of abandonment. Dust covered every surface like gray snow, inches thick on the hardwood floors, in the sheet-draped furniture, and the ornate crystal chandelier that hung from the ceiling. The air was incredibly stale, heavy, and motionless, as if the house itself had stopped breathing the moment its owner died. Marin pulled her phone from her pocket and activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the curved staircase that led to the second floor, the doorway to the parlor, the long hallway that stretched toward the back of the house. And then she saw them. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the dust, cutting a clear path across the foyer floor. Marin's breath caught in her throat. She crouched down, examining the marks more closely. They were boot prints, heavy and deep, made by someone much larger than herself. And the edges were still slightly damp, the disturbed dust not yet fully settled. These prints weren't 4 years old. Someone had been here recently. Within the past few days, maybe within the past few hours. Panic flared in her chest and she froze, straining her ears for any sound of movement. But the house was silent, dead silent. Whatever had made these prints was no longer here, or was very good at staying quiet. Maren forced herself to breathe. She had come too far to run now. Whatever was happening here, whatever her parents had set in motion, she needed to understand it before she could fight it. She followed the footprints. They bypassed the parlor, entirely ignoring the sheet-covered furniture and the dust-caked fireplace. They led straight down the long, shadowed hallway toward the back of the house, toward the room that Maren remembered best of all, her grandfather's workshop. The door was already ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges, as if someone had forced it open. Maren pushed it the rest of the way and stepped inside. Her heart shattered. The workshop had been destroyed. Every drawer from her grandfather's heavy oak workbench had been pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Tiny cogs and springs and delicate clock hands lay scattered across the dusty boards like the innards of eviscerated machines. Glass faces had been smashed, their fragments crunching beneath her feet as she moved deeper into the room. Antique pocket watches had been torn apart, their cases bent and broken, their mechanisms exposed and mangled. Tears burned in Maren's eyes as she surveyed the devastation. This had been her grandfather's sanctuary, his life's work, his legacy of craftsmanship and precision. And someone had torn through it like a tornado, searching for something, destroying everything in their path. But not everything. As Maren's flashlight swept across the room, it caught on something against the far wall that made her pause. Something that stood untouched amidst the chaos, as if the vandals had deliberately left it alone. The grandfather clock. It was Silas Thornwood's masterpiece, and Maren had been fascinated by it since childhood. The clock stood 7 feet tall, its mahogany case polished to a deep reddish gleam, its brass pendulum visible through a glass door etched with delicate scrollwork. The face was ivory white, the numbers painted in elegant gold leaf, the hands frozen at precisely 4:15. The time of her birth. Maren approached the clock slowly, her sneakers crunching on the debris. Why would someone ransack an entire workshop and leave this untouched? It didn't make sense. Unless they hadn't found what they were looking for, unless they had been interrupted, or unless they simply didn't know where to look. A memory surfaced. She was 12 years old, sitting beside her grandfather on the workshop bench while he oiled the gears of a mantel clock. She had asked him where he kept his most valuable pieces, the ones he didn't want anyone to find. Silas had smiled that secret smile of his, the one that always made her feel like they were conspirators in some grand adventure. A true clockmaker never hides his treasures in a safe little bird. He hides them in plain sight, right behind the heartbeat of the house. Behind the heartbeat. Maren reached up toward the top of the grandfather clock, her fingers searching along the decorative wooden crest that crowned the case. There had to be something here. A hidden switch, a secret lever, something that would reveal whatever her grandfather had left behind. Her fingers brushed against metal. It was a tiny lever no larger than her thumbnail, concealed in a groove at the very back of the crest. She pressed it. With a soft click, the entire face of the grandfather clock swung outward on a concealed hinge, revealing a hollow cavity behind the ivory dial. Maren's breath stopped. Inside the compartment, perfectly preserved, sat two objects. A thick leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with age and handling, and a heavy manila envelope sealed with red wax. She reached in and pulled out the journal first. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her fingers, and when she opened it to the first page, she recognized the handwriting immediately. Elegant, sweeping cursive, the ink still dark after all these years, her grandfather's hand. To my dearest Maren, the first line read, "If you are reading this, then my daughter Cordelia has done exactly what I calculated she would do. She has shown you her true face." Maren's knees buckled. She sank to the floor amidst the scattered clock parts, her back against the workbench, and began to read. "I am sorry, my brave girl." The words continued. "Truly, deeply sorry. Not for what I have done, but for what has been done to you. You deserved better parents. You deserved a family that loved you for who you are, not for what you could provide them. But we do not choose our blood, only how we respond to its betrayals. You must listen to me carefully now. The house is not what it seems, and neither is the money your parents have built their empire upon. What follows is the truth, the whole truth, a truth that I spent the last 3 decades of my life trying to prove, and that your father and mother have spent those same decades trying to bury. 30 years ago, I was not just a clockmaker. I was an engineer, an inventor. I held patents on mechanical systems that revolutionized the shipping and logistics industry. Automated sorting algorithms, precision conveyor mechanisms, innovations that transformed how packages moved through warehouses and distribution centers. Your father, Preston Ashford, was my lawyer at the time, a young man ambitious and charming, recently married to my daughter. I trusted him with everything. My inventions, my paperwork, my future. It was the greatest mistake of my life. Preston did not file my patents under my name. He forged my signature on transfer documents. He buried me in litigation when I discovered the theft using my own money against me until I was bankrupted and broken. And then he took my inventions and built Ashford Global Logistics, a billion-dollar empire constructed entirely on the foundation of my stolen work. I spent 20 years fighting them in court. I spent every penny I had and then some trying to prove what they had done. But they had the money and they had the judges and they had the power to make an eccentric old clockmaker look like a bitter, jealous fool. I lost everything except this house and the truth. But Preston made one fatal error, little bird. In his arrogance, he never obtained the original documents, the handwritten blueprints, the notarized affidavits from the engineering firm that witnessed my creation of the sorting algorithm, the correspondence with the patent office that proves the timeline of invention. He only has copies, copies that he altered, copies that would crumble under proper forensic scrutiny. The originals are here, in this house, in the basement vault that I built with my own hands 30 years ago, waiting for the day when someone would finally be able to use them. I left everything to you, Marin, because you are the only one I trust. Cordelia chose money over blood long ago. She married Preston knowing what he had done, and she has been complicit in his crimes ever since. They see you as nothing more than a means to an end, a legal mechanism that can be manipulated into signing away the evidence of their sins. But I have watched you, little bird. On those precious visits when your father brought you to see me, I saw the way you looked at the world, with curiosity, with integrity, with the same fierce independence that I once possessed before they broke me. They will try to break you too. They will try to take what is yours. Do not let them. In the basement behind the iron door, you will find everything you need. The original blueprints, the affidavits, the proof, and one more thing that I managed to save before they took everything else. I was not completely broken, my bird. I hid away enough to ensure you would never have to depend on their poisoned money again. The combination to the safe is your exact time of birth, followed by the year I first held you in my arms. Take back what is ours and burn them to the ground. Marin sat motionless on the dusty floor, the journal clutched to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. Her entire life had been a lie. The private schools, the expensive clothes, the European vacations. That funded by theft. All of it built on the ruins of her grandfather's dreams. Her parents hadn't loved her. They had tolerated her, maintained her, kept her close like a chess piece waiting to be played. And now that she was old enough to serve her purpose, they had tried to use her one final time before discarding her completely. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it, feeding on it, the anger was growing, cold and hard and absolutely relentless. They had destroyed her grandfather. They had stolen his life's work and left him to die alone in this crumbling house, surrounded by the broken remnants of his genius. And now they were trying to steal from her too, to take the one thing he had managed to salvage from the wreckage of his existence. Marin would not let them. She would not. A creak from the hallway shattered the silence. Marin's head snapped up, her heart slamming against her ribs. She hadn't imagined it. The floorboards directly behind the workshop door had groaned under the weight of approaching footsteps. She scrambled to her feet, shoving the journal into the inside pocket of her coat. Her flashlight swung wildly, casting jagged shadows across the walls until it finally came to rest on the doorway. A figure stood in the frame. It was a woman, old, perhaps 70, with a face weathered by decades of coastal winds. She wore a heavy yellow rain slicker over a flannel shirt, and her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, completely devoid of warmth or fear. And in her hands, raised and ready, was a double-barreled shotgun pointed directly at Marin's chest. "Put the book down," the woman ordered. Her voice was like grinding gravel, harsh and uncompromising. "Slowly, and keep your hands where I can see them." Marin's hands shot into the air, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. "I'm not," she stammered. "I'm not a thief. I'm Marin. Marin Ashford. Silas Thornwood was my grandfather. I inherited this place." The old woman's eyes narrowed. She studied Marin's face with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if she was searching for something specific in the young woman's features. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. Then slowly the woman lowered the shotgun. She uncocked the hammers with 2 sharp clicks and let the weapon rest against her shoulder. "You have Silas's eyes," she muttered. "Same color, same stubbornness. He always said you would come." The tension drained from Marin's body so quickly that she had to grab the edge of the workbench to keep from collapsing. "He told you about me?" The woman stepped fully into the room, kicking the door shut behind her. "I'm Lorraine Beckett. I live on the ridge about a mile from here. Been there for 40 years. Silas and I were friends, good friends. When he knew he was dying, he asked me to keep watch on the house. Said his granddaughter would come eventually on her 18th birthday and that she'd need to know the truth." Marin's hand moved instinctively to the journal hidden in her coat. "The truth about what happened, about what my father did." Lorraine nodded grimly. She kicked aside a pile of shattered clock gears and leaned against the ruined workbench, her weathered face illuminated by the harsh beam of Marin's flashlight. "Silas told me everything. The patents, the theft, the years of lawsuits that went nowhere. He never stopped fighting, right up until the end. But he was just one old man against a corporation with unlimited resources. He never stood a chance. The journal says there are documents in the basement." Marin's voice was steadying, now the shock giving way to a cold, focused determination. "Original blueprints, proof that he invented everything. There's a vault down there," Lorraine confirmed. "Heavy steel door with a lock I've never been able to crack. Silas told me you'd have the key." Marin pulled the rusted iron skeleton key from her pocket. It glinted dully in the flashlight beam. Lorraine's eyes widened slightly. "So that's where it ended up. Cordelia tore this place apart after the funeral looking for that key. Never found it. I took it from her desk," Marin said. 2 years ago, I don't know why. I just knew it was important. Instinct." Lorraine nodded approvingly. "Silas always said you had good instincts. Said you were the only one in that family worth a damn." The compliment warmed something in Marin's chest, but she pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for sentiment later. Right now, she needed information. "Those footprints in the foyer." She gestured toward the destruction surrounding them. "Who did this?" Lorraine's expression darkened. "They came 3 days ago. 2 men in expensive suits driving a black SUV with out-of-state plates, Connecticut plates. One of them did most of the talking. Kept making calls on a satellite phone reporting back to someone. I watched from the ridge with my binoculars." "Did they find the basement?" "They found the door," Lorraine said, "but they couldn't get through. The vault is built into solid rock, and the lock is old-fashioned. No modern tools could crack it. They left to get cutting equipment, torches, and such. Said they'd be back." Marin's blood ran cold when Lorraine met her eyes steadily. "Tonight. They're probably already on their way." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marin had beaten them here, but only barely. And if they returned to find her inside the house with her grandfather's journal in her possession and the basement vault within reach, she had no doubt what would happen. "I need to get down there," Marin said. "Now, before they come back." Lorraine studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The basement door is in the servants' corridor past the kitchen, hidden behind a false pantry that they already smashed through. She pushed herself upright, wincing as her knees popped. "I'll keep watch. If I hear engines coming up the drive, I'll give you a warning. Do whatever you have to do down there, and do it fast. You're not coming with me." Lorraine shook her head. "This is your inheritance, girl. Your fight. Silas left those documents for you, not for me. I'll do what I can to buy you time, but the rest is up to you." She moved toward the workshop door, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. Your grandfather was a good man, Marin Ashford, one of the best I ever knew. They broke him, but they never broke his spirit. He spent his last years preparing for this moment, putting everything in place so that someone could finally finish what he started. Her gray eyes were fierce in the dim light. Don't let him down. Then she was gone, her heavy boots echoing down the hallway toward the front of the house. Marin stood alone in the ruined workshop, surrounded by the shattered remnants of her grandfather's life work. In her pocket, the leather journal pressed against her chest like a talisman. In her hand, the rusted iron key gleamed with purpose. She had come to this house looking for answers. She had found something far more valuable. She had found a weapon, and she intended to use it. Marin turned and walked out of the workshop, heading deeper into the house toward the basement door and the truth that waited below. The old floorboards creaked beneath her feet, but she no longer flinched at the sound. She was done being afraid. Her parents had made a terrible mistake. They had taught her to be obedient, compliant, grateful for the privileges they had bestowed upon her. They had never imagined that she might refuse, that she might fight back. But Silas Thornwood had known. He had seen the gears inside her, the stubborn independence that no amount of money or manipulation could suppress. And he had planned for this moment with the same meticulous precision that he had applied to his clocks. Every piece in its place, every mechanism aligned, and now finally the clock was about to strike. Marin found the basement door exactly where Lorraine had described it. The false pantry had been violently torn away from the wall, its shelves splintered and its contents scattered across the floor of the narrow servants' corridor. Behind it, set into solid stone, was a heavy iron door. Deep gouges scarred the metal frame where someone had tried to pry it open with the crowbars. The lock mechanism, a massive circular iron keyhole, had resisted every attempt at forced entry. Whoever had done this had been desperate, but they had also been defeated. Marin slid the rusted skeleton key into the lock. It fit perfectly. She gripped the key with both hands and twisted. The internal tumblers groaned in protest, fighting against decades of disuse. For a moment, she thought the mechanism might be too corroded, too frozen with age to function. Then, with a heavy clunk that echoed through the silent house, the lock released. Marin pulled the handle and the iron door swung outward on massive hinges, revealing a descending staircase plunged into absolute darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of stone and metal, and something else, something dry and preserved. The smell of secrets that had been kept for 30 years. Marin pulled her phone from her pocket, activated the flashlight, and began to descend. The stairs were wooden and steep, creaking under her weight with each step. She counted as she went. 10 steps, 20, 30. The temperature dropped steadily, the air growing colder and drier until she finally reached the bottom and stepped onto solid concrete. She swept the flashlight across the space before her and felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't a basement, it was an archive. Filing cabinets lined the concrete walls, their metal surfaces gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. In the center of the room sat a heavy steel drafting table, its surface clean and organized, covered with what looked like technical drawings protected by plastic sleeves. And bolted to the far wall, its presence dominating the entire space, was a massive safe. It was a Mosler industrial grade, the kind of vault that banks use to protect their most valuable assets. Its surface was thick steel, its door fitted with a combination dial the size of a dinner plate. It looked like it could withstand a direct hit from a missile. Marin set her phone on the drafting table, angling the light to illuminate the safe. Then she pulled out her grandfather's journal and flipped to the final pages, searching for the combination. The numbers were there exactly where Silas had promised. Her exact time of birth, followed by the year he had first held her in his arms, 4:15 a.m. 2008, 4152008. Marin approached the safe and gripped the heavy dial. Her hands were trembling again, but not from cold this time. She spun the dial slowly, carefully feeling each click of the mechanism as the numbers aligned. 0, 4, 1, 5, 2, 0, 0, 8. A heavy, satisfying clunk echoed through the basement. Marin gripped the handle and pulled. The thick steel doors swung open, revealing the contents within. Her grandfather's truth and her inheritance. On the top shelf sat a stack of yellowed blueprint tubes, each one stamped with Silas Thornwood's official seal and dated more than 30 years ago. Beside them lay a bound stack of legal documents, their pages brittle with age, but their text still perfectly legible. Notarized affidavits, witness statements, correspondence with the United States Patent Office, the original proof of invention, the evidence that Preston Ashford had stolen everything he had. On the second shelf was a sealed manila envelope addressed to the legal department of Whitfield Partners, the corporation that was currently negotiating to purchase Ashford Global Logistics. Inside, Marin knew without opening, it would be a detailed summary of the fraud prepared by her grandfather for the day when someone would finally be able to deliver it. And on the bottom shelf, nestled in a small black leather box, was one final gift. Marin opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay a cashier's check drawn from a secure offshore account. The payee line read Marin Ashford. The amount was written in neat, precise numbers, $2 million. A folded note accompanied the check written in her grandfather's familiar hand. I was not completely broken, my bird. I hid away enough to ensure you would never have to depend on their poisoned money again. Take them down. Marin stared at the check for a long moment. Then she looked at the blueprints, the affidavits, the sealed envelope. The sum total of her grandfather's 30-year battle preserved and protected, waiting for the moment when someone could finally wield them. She had come to this house with nothing. Now she held the power to destroy an empire. The sound of an engine echoed from somewhere above her head. Marin's heart seized in her chest. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of car doors, the muffled sound of voices. Multiple voices. They were here. She moved fast. She grabbed the blueprint tubes, the bound documents, the sealed envelope, shoving everything into the canvas backpack that still hung from her shoulders. The cashier's check went into her inside coat pocket next to the leather journal. She left the safe hanging open, there was no time to close it, and sprinted for the stairs. Halfway up, she heard Lorraine's voice bellowing from the front of the house. "Stop right there or I'll put a hole through that expensive suit." Then a man's voice, smooth and arrogant, replied, "Put the antique away, Grandma, before you hurt yourself." Marin froze on the stairs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She recognized that voice. She had heard it 100 times at company functions, at holiday dinners, at the endless parade of corporate events that her parents had dragged her to throughout her childhood. Vincent Caulfield, her father's vice president of operations, his most trusted fixer, the man who made problems disappear. And he was standing between her and the only exit. Marin's mind raced. She had the documents, the proof, everything she needed to destroy Ashford Global Logistics and everyone connected to it. But none of that mattered if Vincent and his men got their hands on her before she could escape. She needed a plan. She needed a weapon. She needed to think like her grandfather. A true clockmaker never hides his treasures in a safe. He hides them in plain sight. Marin looked down at the backpack, in her hands heavy with 30 years of evidence. Then she looked back at the basement behind her, at the archive filled with filing cabinets and drafting tables. And slowly a cold smile spread across her face. They wanted the documents. They had come all this way, spent all this money, destroyed her entire life just to get their hands on the proof that could send them all to prison. She was going to use that desperation against them. Marin Ashford took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and climbed the final stairs into the light. The hallway stretched before her like a gauntlet. Marin emerged from the basement stairwell into the dim light of the servants' quarter, her canvas backpack heavy with 30 years of evidence. She could hear voices from the front of the house now, Lorraine's gravelly threats mixing with the smooth, condescending tones of Vincent Caulfield. The confrontation was escalating. She had seconds, maybe less, before they came looking for her. Marin's hands moved with desperate speed. She yanked open her backpack and pulled out the stack of blueprint tubes, the bound affidavits, the sealed envelope. Her phone was still in her pocket, and she fumbled it out with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it twice before she managed to activate the camera. The hallway was too dark. She couldn't get clear shots. She ducked into the kitchen, where a grimy window let in just enough gray afternoon light to illuminate the documents. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she spread the papers across the cracked linoleum counter, her phone clicking frantically as she photographed page after page. The original blueprints stamped with her grandfather's seal. The notarized affidavits signed by witnesses who had watched Silas Thornwood create his inventions. The correspondence with the Patent Office dated 3 months before Preston Ashford had filed his fraudulent claims. Every piece of evidence, every damning page. Marin's fingers flew across the screen, uploading the images to her cloud storage. The connection was weak this far out in the Maine woods. and the upload progress bar crawled with agonizing slowness. 15%, 23%, 31%. Footsteps thundered down the hallway behind her. 47%, 52%. A man's voice called out, "She's not at the front. Check the back rooms." 68%, 74%. Marin shoved the physical documents back into her backpack, her movements frantic. She needed more time. She needed the upload to finish. She needed 89%, 93%. The kitchen door crashed open. 100%. Upload complete. Vincent Caulfield stood in the doorway, flanked by two massive men in dark jackets. He was exactly as Marin remembered him from corporate functions, tall and lean, in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver-streaked hair immaculately styled, his face handsome in a cold, predatory way. His eyes swept across the kitchen, taking in the scattered documents on the counter, the phone clutched in Marin's white-knuckled grip, the backpack bulging with evidence. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, well, his voice was silk over steel. The prodigal daughter. Your parents have been worried sick about you, Marin. Running away from home, stealing family property, breaking into an estate that doesn't belong to you. Very concerning behavior for a young woman your age. Marin shoved her phone into her pocket, praying that he hadn't seen her uploading files. This property does belong to me. My grandfather left it to me in his will. I have every legal right to be here. Vincent's smile didn't waver. He stepped fully into the kitchen, and the two men behind him fanned out to block any possibility of escape. Legal rights are such flexible things, aren't they? Your mother is listed as executor of Silas Thornwood's estate. Any transfer of property requires her approval until the trust is formally dissolved, which I'm afraid hasn't happened yet. He was lying. Marin knew he was lying. The trust had been set up specifically to bypass Cordelia's control, to ensure that the property passed directly to Marin on her 18th birthday without any interference from her parents. But arguing legal technicalities with a corporate fixer in an abandoned house in Maine was not going to help her situation. What do you want, Vincent? He moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the dirty linoleum. We want the same thing we've always wanted, Marin. The documents your grandfather hid in this house. The original patents, the affidavits, all the evidence he spent his pathetic life collecting. He gestured toward her backpack. And it appears you found them for us. How convenient. You can't have them. Vincent laughed, a soft, genuine sound that somehow made him more terrifying. Oh, Marin, you sound just like your grandfather. Stubborn to the last. Do you know how many years he wasted trying to prove what we did? How many lawyers he hired? How many lawsuits he filed? How many times he stood in front of judges and begged them to see the truth? His smile turned cruel. It never mattered. It will never matter. Your father built an empire, and empires don't fall because one bitter old man kept some papers in a basement. They fall when someone with power decides to tear them down. And you, my dear girl, have no power at all. He snapped his fingers, and the two men moved forward. Marin tried to run. She made it exactly 3 steps before a massive hand closed around her arm, spinning her around and slamming her against the kitchen counter. The backpack was ripped from her shoulders, the documents scattered across the floor. She struggled, kicked, tried to scream, but a calloused palm clamped over her mouth, muffling her voice. Vincent stood over her, his cold eyes examining her the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope. You know what the problem with your generation is, Marin? You've been told your whole life that you're special, that you matter, that your voice deserves to be heard. He picked up one of the blueprint tubes and examined it casually. But the truth is you don't matter at all. You're a minor inconvenience, a loose end that needs to be tied up. Your parents will sign the appropriate paperwork, the property will be transferred, and you will disappear into whatever miserable life awaits teenage runaways with no money and no prospects. He nodded to his men. Put her in the basement. Lock the door. We'll deal with her later. Marin fought with everything she had. She bit the hand covering her mouth, tasting blood, and managed to let out a single scream before a fist connected with her stomach, doubling her over in agony. They dragged her down the hallway, her sneakers scraping uselessly against the hardwood floor, her vision blurring with tears of pain and rage. The iron door to the basement stood open exactly as she had left it. They threw her through the doorway, and she tumbled down the steep wooden stairs, her body bouncing off the steps until she crashed onto the cold concrete floor below. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut was Vincent Caulfield's silhouette framed by the light from the hallway above. Sweet dreams, little bird. Then the deadbolt clicked into place, and she was swallowed by absolute darkness. For a long time, Maren didn't move. She lay on the freezing concrete, her body throbbing with pain, her mind reeling from the violence of the past few minutes. The basement was utterly black, so dark that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the distant, muffled footsteps of the men moving around in the house above her. They had the documents. The originals, the irreplaceable evidence that her grandfather had spent 30 years protecting. The blueprints, the affidavits, the sealed envelope addressed to Whitfield Partners. All of it was gone. She had failed. The thought hit her like a physical blow, and she curled into a ball on the cold floor, her arms wrapped around her aching stomach. She had come so close. She had found the truth, touched it with her own hands, felt the weight of justice waiting to be delivered. And now it was all for nothing. Her parents would win. They always won. They had the money, the lawyers, the connections, the power. What did she have? A rusted key and a dead man's memories, and a body covered in bruises locked in a basement with no way out. No way out. The words echoed in her mind, and something shifted. She had been lying here feeling sorry for herself, wallowing in defeat when she should have been thinking, planning, fighting. That wasn't who she was. That wasn't who her grandfather had raised her to be. Maren pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, ignoring the screaming protest of her bruised muscles. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers closing around the familiar shape of her phone. The screen lit up when she pressed the button, its glow cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The first thing she checked was the cloud storage app. Upload complete, 53 files successfully saved. A sob of relief escaped her throat. They had the physical documents, but she had the digital copies. Every blueprint, every affidavit, every page of evidence was now safely stored on a remote server, accessible from any device with an internet connection. Vincent had taken the paper, but she had preserved the truth. It wasn't over yet. But she was still trapped in a basement with a locked iron door at the top of the stairs and no other obvious exit. Her phone showed no cell signal this far underground, which meant she couldn't call for help. And even if she could, who would she call? The local police? Vincent had already mentioned that they had legal authorization from her mother, which meant any law enforcement response would probably end with Maren being handed back to her parents in handcuffs. She was on her own. Maren swept her phone's flashlight across the basement, examining her prison with new eyes. The filing cabinets, the drafting table, the massive Mosler safe still hanging open against the far wall. Concrete floor, stone walls, low ceiling, reinforced with wooden beams. Her grandfather had built this place. He had designed it, constructed it, spent 30 years maintaining it as a secret repository for his evidence. A man that careful, that methodical, would never have created a space with only one exit. There had to be another way out. Maren tried to remember everything her grandfather had ever told her about the house. The architecture, the history, the quirks of the old Victorian structure. He had mentioned something once during one of her childhood visits about the basement being built into the bedrock of the coastal cliffs. The original owners had used it to store provisions that needed to stay cool year-round. And before that, during the Prohibition era, smugglers had used similar spaces to move contraband. Smugglers who would have needed secret exits to the sea. Maren began searching the walls, running her hands along the cold stone surface, looking for any irregularity, any seam, any indication of a hidden passage. She worked methodically, starting at the far corner near the safe and moving clockwise around the room. Minutes passed, her fingers grew numb from the cold stone, and her injured body screamed for rest. But she kept searching, kept pressing, kept looking for the exit she knew had to be there. And then she found it. Behind one of the filing cabinets, partially hidden by decades of accumulated dust, was a rectangular metal grate set into the stone wall. It was about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, covered with a rusted iron lattice that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A ventilation shaft. Maren grabbed the edge of the filing cabinet and pulled. Her bruised muscles protested, but the cabinet was empty. Its contents long since removed to the safe, and it scraped across the concrete floor with a screech that made her wince. She froze, listening for any indication that the men above had heard. Nothing. The basement was too deep, the stone walls too thick. She crouched in front of the grate, examining it closely. The iron lattice was bolted to the stone frame, with 4 heavy screws, their heads crusted with rust. She needed a screwdriver or something that could function as one. Marin swept her flashlight across the basement, searching for tools. The drafting table had several drawers built into its base, and she yanked them open one by one, rifling through the contents. Pencils, rulers, compasses, and there in the bottom drawer a small toolkit that her grandfather had probably used for precision work on his clock mechanisms. She grabbed a flathead screwdriver and returned to the grate. The first screw took almost 10 minutes to remove. The rust had fused the metal together, and she had to chip away at it, piece by piece, her fingers cramping around the screwdriver handle. The second screw was slightly easier, the third easier still. By the time she attacked the fourth, her hands were bleeding from small cuts, but she barely noticed. The grate fell away from the wall with a clatter. Behind it, disappearing into darkness, was a narrow tunnel cut directly into the bedrock. The walls were rough and unfinished, the floor sloping gradually downward. Cold air flowed through the opening, carrying the unmistakable scent of salt water. The sea. The tunnel led to the sea. Marin didn't hesitate. She shoved her phone into her pocket, got down on her hands and knees, and crawled into the darkness. The tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders. The rough stone scraped against her jacket as she crawled, tearing the fabric in places and leaving raw scratches on her skin. She couldn't see anything beyond the narrow beam of her phone's flashlight, which she held in one hand while pulling herself forward with the other. The passage twisted and turned, following the natural contours of the bedrock. At times it narrowed so much that she had to turn sideways to squeeze through her breath, coming in short, panicked gasps as the walls pressed in from all sides. Claustrophobia clawed at the edges of her mind, but she forced it down, forced herself to keep moving, keep crawling, keep fighting. She had no idea how long the tunnel was. It felt like miles, though it was probably only a few hundred feet. The salt smell grew stronger as she progressed, and the stone beneath her hands became damp, then wet, coated with a thin layer of sea spray that seeped through the porous rock. And then suddenly the tunnel opened up. Marin emerged onto a narrow stone ledge jutting out from the face of a sheer cliff. Below her, maybe 30 feet down, waves crashed against jagged rocks with a sound like continuous thunder. Above her, the cliff face rose toward a gray sky heavy with impending snow. And stretching out before her, vast and endless, was the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. She had made it. She was out. Marin pressed her back against the cliff face, her legs trembling so badly that she could barely stand. The ledge was maybe 3 feet wide, slick with sea spray, with no obvious path leading up or down. But there had to be something, some way to reach the surface. The smugglers who had built this tunnel wouldn't have created a dead end. She looked up, scanning the cliff face with her flashlight. There, about 15 feet above her, a series of iron rungs had been driven into the rock, forming a crude ladder that led to what looked like an overgrown path at the top of the cliff. The rungs were rusted and ancient, but they appeared to be solidly anchored. Marin began to climb. Her injured body protested every movement. Her arms shook with exhaustion, and her fingers slipped on the wet iron more than once, sending her heart lurching into her throat. But she kept climbing one rung at a time, refusing to look down at the churning water below. When she finally pulled herself over the edge of the cliff and collapsed onto solid ground, she lay there for a long moment, gasping for breath, staring up at the gray sky as the first flakes of snow began to fall. She was alive. She was free. And she still had the evidence. The overgrown path led through dense coastal scrub, eventually connecting to a gravel road that Marin recognized as the rear boundary of her grandfather's property. She was about half a mile from the house, which she could just barely see through the trees, its dark silhouette looming against the evening sky. Vincent's SUV was still parked in the driveway. They hadn't left yet. They were probably still inside, celebrating their victory, congratulating themselves on neutralizing the troublesome teenager who had dared to challenge their power. They had no idea she had escaped. Marin moved through the trees until she reached the edge of Lorraine Beckett's property. The old woman's cabin was a modest structure of weathered cedar shingles, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and warm light glowing through the windows. Marin approached cautiously, not wanting to startle the woman who had threatened her with a shotgun just hours earlier. She needn't have worried. The door opened before she reached the porch, and Lorraine stepped out with a wool blanket draped over her arm. "Saw you coming through the trees." The old woman's voice was gruff, but not unkind. "You look like hell, girl. Get inside before you freeze to death." The cabin's interior was warm and simple. A wood-burning stove dominated one corner, radiating heat that seeped into Marin's frozen bones. Lorraine guided her to a worn armchair near the fire, wrapped her in the wool blanket, and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned with a mug of hot coffee and a first aid kit. "Drink that," she handed Marin the mug. "Then we'll see about those cuts." Marin sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. They took the documents. Vincent and his men. They locked me in the basement. Lorraine's weathered face remained impassive. "But you got out. There was a tunnel, through the cliff to the sea. Grandfather must have known about it." "He did." Lorraine opened the first aid kit and began cleaning the cuts on Marin's hands with antiseptic that stung like fire. "He showed it to me once years ago. Said it was his insurance policy. A way out if things ever got bad." Marin winced at the sting but didn't pull away. "They have the original papers, the blueprints, the affidavits, everything." Lorraine paused her ministrations and looked Marin directly in the eyes. "So it's over, no?" Marin reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I photographed everything before they caught me, uploaded it to the cloud. They have the paper, but I have the proof." A slow smile spread across Lorraine's weathered face. "Silas always said you were clever." Marin set down the coffee mug, her mind already racing ahead to the next step. "I need to contact someone. Someone with enough power to actually use this evidence. The company my father is trying to sell to. Their CEO. If I can reach him, if I can show him what my father really is, the whole deal falls apart." "Whitfield Partners," Lorraine nodded slowly. "I've heard the name. Some big investment firm supposed to be buying out Ashford Global for hundreds of millions. 300 million. Marin pulled up her phone's browser, searching for information on the company. "If the acquisition goes through, my parents walk away clean. They pay off their debts, cash out their shares, and disappear to some island somewhere while the truth stays buried forever. And if it doesn't go through, then Ashford Global collapses under its own weight. The IRS investigations proceed. The fraud gets exposed. And my parents face actual consequences for what they've done." Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "That's a dangerous game you're playing, girl. Going up against people with that much money and power. They've already shown they're willing to hurt you. If you push them harder, they might do worse." Marin thought about the basement, the darkness, the feeling of absolute helplessness as Vincent Caulfield smiled down at her, secure in his victory. She thought about her grandfather spending 30 years trying to get justice and dying without ever seeing it. "I know," her voice was steady, "but I'm not going to spend my life running. Either I fight back now while I still have the chance, or I let them win forever. And I can't do that. I won't." Lorraine studied her for a long moment, her gray eyes searching Marin's face. Then she nodded once decisively. "There's a phone book in the kitchen drawer. Landlines on the wall. Cell service is spotty out here, but the landline runs through the phone company's system. Should be able to reach anyone in the country." Marin rose from the chair, her legs steadier now, her resolve hardening into something cold and unbreakable. "Thank you, Lorraine, for everything. Don't thank me yet." The old woman settled into her own chair by the fire, her shotgun resting across her knees. "You've got a long night ahead of you, and I have a feeling it's going to get worse before it gets better." Marin found the phone book and began searching for Whitfield Partners. Edmund Whitfield was not an easy man to reach. Marin spent the first hour working through the company's automated phone system, transferred from department to department, put on hold for minutes at a time, and eventually disconnected twice when the system failed to route her call properly. She tried again from the beginning, pressing different numbers, asking for different extensions, until finally a human voice answered. "Whitfield Partners Executive Offices. This is Patricia speaking." Marin gripped the phone receiver tightly, forcing her voice to remain calm and professional. "My name is Marin Ashford. I need to speak with Edmund Whitfield immediately regarding the Ashford Global Logistics acquisition." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ashford, but Mr. Whitfield doesn't take unsolicited calls. If you'd like to leave a message with his assistant, this isn't unsolicited." Marin cut her off. "This is urgent. I have evidence that the acquisition is based on fraudulent intellectual property claims. Evidence that could expose Whitfield Partners to significant legal liability if the deal proceeds." Another pause, longer this time. The woman's voice was noticeably cooler when she spoke again. "That's a very serious accusation, Ms. Ashford. Do you have any proof to support these claims? I have original patent documents, notarized witness statements." Correspondence showing that the technology behind Ashford Global was stolen from its actual inventor 30 years ago. Marin took a deep breath. The inventor was my grandfather, Silas Thornwood, and the man who stole from him was my father, Preston Ashford. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Then the woman spoke again, her tone completely changed. Please hold, Ms. Ashford. I'm transferring you to Mr. Whitfield's direct line. Soft classical music replaced the woman's voice, and Marin leaned against the kitchen wall, her heart pounding. This was it. This was her one chance to reach someone with the power to actually make a difference. The music cut off, Ms. Ashford. A deep, measured voice filled the line. This is Edmund Whitfield. Patricia tells me you have some rather explosive claims about the acquisition we're finalizing with your father's company. Marin straightened instinctively, as if the man could see her through the phone. Mr. Whitfield, thank you for taking my call. I know how this must sound, but I can prove everything I'm saying. I'm listening. 30 years ago, my grandfather invented the automated sorting algorithm and precision conveyor systems that form the foundation of Ashford Global Logistics. He was an engineer and a clockmaker, a man who spent his life creating mechanical solutions to complex problems. He trusted my father, who was his lawyer at the time, to file the patents and protect his intellectual property. And your father betrayed that trust. He forged my grandfather's signature, filed the patents under his own name, used the money from the stolen technology to build a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marin's voice hardened. My grandfather spent the rest of his life trying to prove what happened, but my father had all the resources, the best lawyers, the judges in his pocket. He buried my grandfather in litigation until there was nothing left. Edmund Whitfield was quiet for a moment. And you have proof of this original documents, the handwritten blueprints with my grandfather's seal dated 3 months before my father's patent applications. Notarized affidavits from the engineering firm that witnessed my grandfather's work. Letters to the patent office that established the true timeline of invention. Marin paused. I photographed everything. I can send you the files right now if you give me an email address. Another long pause. Ms. Ashford, do you understand the implications of what you're telling me? If these documents are authentic, Whitfield Partners would be acquiring a company built entirely on fraud. The legal exposure alone would be catastrophic. I understand perfectly, Mr. Whitfield. That's why I'm calling you. My father is counting on this acquisition to save his company from bankruptcy. The IRS is already investigating. The debts are mounting. If you walk away from the deal, everything collapses. And what do you want in return for this information, Justice? Marin said simply. My grandfather died without ever seeing the truth come out. My parents threw me out of my own home because I refused to help them cover up what they'd done. I don't want money. I don't want revenge. I want the truth to finally matter. Edmund Whitfield exhaled slowly. Send me the documents, Ms. Ashford. My personal email is e.whitfield@whitfieldpartners.com. I'll have my legal team review them tonight. If they're authentic, I give you my word that this acquisition will not proceed. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Don't thank me yet. His voice carried a note of warning. If your evidence holds up, your family is going to face serious consequences. Federal investigation, criminal charges, public disgrace. You understand what you're setting in motion. Marin thought about her grandfather dying alone in a crumbling house with nothing but broken clocks and bitter memories. She thought about her mother's face twisted with rage, screaming that Marin was no longer part of the family. She thought about the cold concrete floor of the basement and the weight of Vincent Caulfield's boot on her wrist as he ripped the backpack from her hands. I understand, she said. Send me your email confirmation. I'll have the documents to you within the hour. The email took 45 minutes to compose. Marin sat at Lorraine's ancient desktop computer, a machine that wheezed and groaned with every click, painstakingly attaching each photograph to the message. She organized the files, carefully arranging them in chronological order, with brief explanations of what each document represented. The original blueprints dated March 1994, bearing Silas Thornwood's personal seal and signature. The notarized affidavits from 3 engineers at the Henderson manufacturing firm confirming that they had witnessed Silas demonstrate his automated sorting system in February of the same year. The correspondence with the United States Patent Office showing Silas's initial inquiries about patent protection dated January 1994. And finally, the patent applications filed by Preston Ashford in June 1994, 3 months after Silas's documented invention claiming the technology as his own original work. The evidence was overwhelming. Any competent lawyer would see immediately that Preston had committed fraud, that he had stolen his father-in-law's life work and built an empire on the theft. Marin attached the final file, wrote a brief cover letter summarizing the situation, and clicked send. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Lorraine's internet connection was slow, barely faster than dial-up, and each file took minutes to upload. Marin watched the percentage climb with growing anxiety, hyper-aware of every passing minute. Outside the cabin windows, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. The evening light was fading fast, turning the world into a monochrome landscape of white and gray. Somewhere in the darkness, Vincent Caulfield and his men were probably still at her grandfather's house, going through the documents they had stolen, congratulating themselves on their success. They had no idea what was coming. The email sent successfully at 7:47 p.m. Marin slumped back in the chair, exhausted beyond words. She had done everything she could. The evidence was in Edmund Whitfield's hands now. Whatever happened next was beyond her control. Lorraine appeared in the doorway, a bowl of steaming soup in her hands. "You need to eat something. You've been running on adrenaline for 18 hours. Your body's going to crash if you don't fuel it." Marin accepted the bowl gratefully. The soup was homemade, thick with vegetables and chunks of beef, warming her from the inside out. She ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, her mind still churning through the implications of what she had done. "What happens now?" Lorraine asked, settling into a chair across from her. "We wait." Edmund Whitfield said his legal team would review the documents tonight. If they verify the evidence, he'll refuse to proceed with the acquisition. And if he doesn't believe you, then my parents win. Marin set down the empty bowl. They get their $300 million, pay off their debts, and disappear somewhere I can't reach them. And I spend the rest of my life knowing that I had the truth in my hands and couldn't make anyone believe it. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "Silas would be proud of you, you know. Regardless of how this turns out, you did everything he hoped you would do." Marin felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. "I just wish I could have known him better. Those few visits, the time we spent in his workshop, it wasn't enough. There's so much I never got to ask him." "He wrote letters," Lorraine said softly. "Dozens of them, sealed, dated, stored in a fireproof box that he kept in my attic. Letters addressed to you, meant to be delivered on your 21st birthday if he didn't live to see it." Marin's breath caught. Letters. His thoughts. His memories. His advice for the life you'd live after he was gone. Lorraine's weathered face creased with something like a smile. He knew he might not survive to see you grown. He wanted to make sure you had his voice, even if you couldn't have his presence. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, streaming down Marin's face as the weight of everything finally crashed over her. The betrayal and the fear and the desperate fight for survival, all of it dissolved in a wave of grief for the grandfather she had barely known, the man who had loved her enough to plan for her salvation from beyond the grave. Lorraine didn't say anything. She just moved to sit beside Marin, her weathered hand resting gently on the young woman's shoulder, offering silent comfort while the storm passed. They sat that way for a long time. The phone rang at 9:23 p.m. Marin snatched the receiver from its cradle, her heart hammering. "Hello, Ms. Ashford." Edmund Whitfield's voice was grave. "My legal team has completed their preliminary review of your documents, and the evidence is compelling. The timeline is clear. The signatures and seals appear authentic, though we'll need to conduct full forensic analysis to confirm." There was a pause. "Based on what we've seen, Whitfield Partners is formally withdrawing from the Ashford Global acquisition effective immediately." Marin's knees nearly buckled. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. "You're walking away from a $300 million deal. I'm protecting my company from acquiring a fraud-riddled liability." Edmund's voice hardened. "Ms. Ashford, I've been in business for 40 years. I've seen men like your father before. Smooth, charming, utterly ruthless. They build their empires on other people's backs and convince themselves that success justifies the means, but it doesn't. It never does. What happens now? My legal team is drafting a formal letter to Preston Ashford informing him of our withdrawal and the reasons for it. We're also preparing a report for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Edmund paused again. What your father did wasn't just theft. It was securities fraud on a massive scale. Every investor who bought into Ashford Global, every partner who trusted the company's representations, they were all deceived. You're reporting him to the FBI. I'm reporting him to everyone who needs to know. Edmund's voice softened slightly. You did the right thing, Ms. Ashford. I know it doesn't feel like it right now. I know you've lost your family and your home and everything you thought you knew about your life, but you did the right thing. Marin closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield, for believing me. Thank me when this is over. His tone turned businesslike again. In the meantime, I'd suggest you find somewhere safe to stay. When your parents learn that the acquisition has fallen through, they're going to be looking for someone to blame. And you're the most obvious target. I understand. Good luck, Ms. Ashford. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. Marin stood in Lorraine's kitchen, the phone receiver still pressed to her ear, staring at nothing. It was done. The acquisition was dead. Her parents' escape route had been sealed off. The empire was going to fall. Girl Lorraine's voice came from the doorway. What did he say? He believed me. Marin set the phone back in its cradle, her voice barely above a whisper. He's withdrawing from the deal. He's reporting my father to the FBI. Lorraine exhaled slowly. Then it's really happening. Yes. Marin turned to face her. It's really happening. Before either of them could say anything else, a new sound cut through the quiet of the cabin. The crunch of tires on gravel, the sweep of headlights across the front windows, the rumble of an expensive engine pulling into Lorraine's driveway. Marin's blood turned to ice. She moved to the window, pressing herself against the wall to peer out without being seen. A black Mercedes sedan had stopped in front of the cabin, its headlights blazing through the falling snow. The driver's door opened and a figure stepped out into the storm. Even through the swirling white, Marin recognized her immediately. Cordelia Ashford stood in the snow, her designer coat pulled tight against the cold, her auburn hair whipping in the wind. She stared at the cabin with eyes that burned with barely contained fury. She had come to Maine herself. She had come to finish what Vincent had started. Lorraine appeared at Marin's shoulder, her shotgun already in her hands. Looks like your mother got impatient waiting for reports from her lackeys. Marin watched as Cordelia began walking toward the cabin, her expensive heels sinking into the snow with each step. A second figure emerged from the passenger side of the Mercedes. Vincent Caulfield, his charcoal suit disheveled, a dark bruise forming on his temple. They had discovered she was missing. They had tracked her here. Lorraine, I need you to stay out of this. Marin's voice was steady, though her heart was racing. This is between me and my mother. Like hell it is. Lorraine pumped the shotgun with a decisive crack. That woman is on my property. I have every right to know. Marin turned to face her, meeting the old woman's eyes. You've done enough. You've done more than enough. But this has to end with me facing her directly. If I hide behind you, if I let someone else fight my battles, it will never really be over. Lorraine studied her for a long moment, her gray eyes sharp and calculating. Then slowly she lowered the shotgun. Your grandfather would say the same thing, she admitted grudgingly. Stubborn fool that he was. A knock thundered against the front door. Marin took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the sound. She had been running from her family her entire life, running from their expectations, running from their control, running from the cold, suffocating weight of their conditional love. Tonight she would stop running. Tonight she would stand and face the truth. Marin Ashford opened the door. Her mother stood on the snow-covered porch, her beautiful face twisted with rage, her designer clothes soaked and stained from trudging through the storm. Behind her, Vincent Caulfield lurked like a shadow, his cold eyes fixed on Marin with undisguised malice. Cordelia Ashford looked at her daughter for a long moment, her breath misting in the freezing air. And then she spoke. You stupid, ungrateful child. Do you have any idea what you've done? The snow swirled between them like a curtain of white silk. Marin stood in the doorway of Lorraine's cabin, the warm light spilling out behind her, staring at the woman who had given her life and then tried to destroy it. Cordelia Ashford looked nothing like the polished society matron who had presided over their Connecticut estate with such imperious grace. Her auburn hair was plastered to her face by the driving snow. Her cashmere coat was soaked through, and her designer heels had been ruined by the half-mile trudge from the main road where the Mercedes had gotten stuck. But her eyes were exactly the same. cold and calculating and utterly devoid of maternal warmth. Do you have any idea what you've done? Cordelia's voice cut through the howling wind like a blade. Whitfield Partners has withdrawn from the acquisition. $300 million gone. Our investors are panicking. The board is demanding answers. And the FBI has opened a formal investigation. Good. Marin's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. That's exactly what I intended. Cordelia's composure cracked just for a moment, revealing the seething fury beneath. You're 18 years old. You have no education, no money, no connections. You're nothing but a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because she didn't get her way. I'm the legal owner of Silas Thornwood's intellectual property. Marin stepped forward out of the doorway into the snow. I'm the only person with access to the original documents that prove Dad stole everything he has. And I'm the one who just destroyed your escape plan. Vincent Caulfield moved closer, his bruised face tight with barely contained violence. Let me handle this, Mrs. Ashford. The girl clearly doesn't understand her situation. No, Cordelia held up a manicured hand, stopping him. No more handling. That's what got us into this mess. She turned back to Marin, her expression shifting into something that almost resembled reason. Marin, darling, I understand that you're upset. The way we handled things in Connecticut was regrettable. We were under tremendous pressure, and we made mistakes. You threw me out of my home on my 18th birthday. We asked you to sign some documents, and you refused. Cordelia's voice dripped with wounded martyrdom. We reacted poorly. I admit that, but surely you can see that this vendetta you're pursuing is only going to hurt everyone involved, including yourself. Marin laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound that she barely recognized as her own. Hurt myself. You've already done everything you can to hurt me. What's left? What else can you possibly take? Cordelia's eyes flickered with something that might have been calculation. We can give you things, Marin. Things you've never had. Real independence. Real security. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded document. This is a settlement agreement. $500,000 transferred to an account in your name in exchange for your signature on the quitclaim deed and your agreement to retract the statements you made to Edmund Whitfield. Marin stared at the paper. $500,000. More money than she had ever imagined possessing. Enough to start a new life anywhere in the world, to go to any college, to build any future she wanted. All she had to do was let her parents escape justice. No, the word hung in the frozen air between them. Cordelia's mask of maternal concern dissolved. You ungrateful little fool. Do you think you have a choice here? Do you think you can just walk away from this family and face no consequences? I already walked away, Marin said. You pushed me out the door yourself, and I can pull you back in. Cordelia's voice dropped to something low and dangerous. You're still my daughter, Marin. Legally, emotionally, biologically. Whatever fantasies you've constructed about being some kind of independent crusader, the reality is that you're an 18-year-old girl with no resources and no support system. The world will chew you up and spit you out. She stepped closer, close enough that Marin could smell her expensive perfume, mixed with the sharp scent of desperation. Sign the papers. Take the money. Go live your little life somewhere far away from here. And let the adults clean up this mess you've made. Marin looked into her mother's eyes, searching for something. Any flicker of genuine emotion. Any trace of the maternal love that mothers were supposed to feel for their children. Any indication that Cordelia Ashford saw her as anything more than an obstacle to be overcome. She found nothing. You know what Grandfather told me once? Marin's voice was soft, almost gentle. He said that people are like clocks, that most people only care about the polished face on the outside. But the truth is in the gears, and if the inside is rotten, eventually the whole thing stops telling the truth. Cordelia's face hardened. Silas was a bitter old man who couldn't accept that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone smarter than him. He was outmaneuvered by a thief and a fraud, Marin corrected, and by the daughter who chose money over her own father. But he saw you clearly, Mother. He saw exactly what you were. And he spent the last 30 years of his life making sure that someone would eventually hold you accountable. She took a step backward toward the warmth of the cabin. I'm not signing anything. I'm not taking your money, and I'm not letting you escape the consequences of what you've done. The FBI has the evidence. Edmund Whitfield has the evidence. It's over. Cordelia's composure shattered. It is not over. Her voice rose to a shriek that cut through the howling wind. Do you understand what will happen if this goes to trial? Your father will go to prison. I will go to prison. The company will be dismantled. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for will be destroyed. And you'll be left with nothing but a crumbling house in Maine and the satisfaction of having ruined your own family. You ruined this family 30 years ago, Marin shot back. When you married a man you knew was a thief. When you helped him steal from your own father. When you raised me to be nothing but a tool for your escape plan. She felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. I was never your daughter. I was an investment, a long-term asset that you cultivated until I was old enough to be useful. And when I refused to perform my function, you threw me away like garbage. Cordelia stared at her, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face. Something that almost looked like regret. Then it was gone. Vincent, her voice was cold and flat. Get the documents. Vincent Caulfield smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside were the original blueprints, the notarized affidavits, everything that Marin had found in her grandfather's vault. We recovered these from the basement before we realized you'd escaped. Vincent's voice was silky with satisfaction. The physical originals, the actual evidence. Everything you photographed and sent to Whitfield Partners is just copies. Digital reproductions that any competent lawyer can challenge in court. He held up the folder, letting Marin see the contents. Without these originals, your case falls apart. The FBI investigation stalls. The acquisition might still be salvaged. He tucked the folder back into his jacket. All we need is your signature on that quitclaim deed, and everything goes back to the way it was. Marin felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had thought she was in control. She had thought that sending the evidence to Edmund Whitfield had sealed her parents' fate. But she had forgotten one crucial detail. Digital copies could be questioned. Digital copies could be dismissed as fabrications. Without the physical originals to support them, her entire case rested on the word of an 18-year-old runaway against a billion-dollar corporation with armies of lawyers. She needed those documents back. But how? Think, she told herself. Think like grandfather would think. What would he do? And then suddenly she knew. All right, Marin let her shoulders slump, let her voice crack with feigned defeat. You win. I'll sign. Cordelia's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Just like that. What choice do I have? Marin gestured toward Vincent and the folder tucked in his jacket. You have the originals. Without them, I can't prove anything. And even if I could, what would I gain? My parents in prison. My family destroyed. She shook her head. I'm tired, Mother. I'm tired of fighting. I just want this to be over. Cordelia studied her for a long moment, searching for deception. But Marin had learned something from 18 years of living with manipulative parents. She had learned how to wear a mask. Finally, Cordelia nodded. Good. She produced the quitclaim deed from her coat pocket. Sign here and here, an initial at the bottom of each page. Marin took the documents, her hands trembling convincingly. She scanned the pages, noting the dense legal language, the careful phrasing that would strip her of any claim to her grandfather's property or intellectual property. She looked up at her mother. I want to talk to Dad first. Cordelia frowned. What? I want to hear his voice. Marin let a tear slip down her cheek. If I'm giving up everything, if I'm letting go of any chance at justice for grandfather, I need to hear Dad say it was worth it. I need to hear him tell me that this is what he wants. Cordelia hesitated. She glanced at Vincent, who shrugged. What harm can it do? Vincent said. The girls already agreed to sign. Let her have her little moment of closure. Cordelia pulled her phone from her pocket. Fine, but make it quick. We need to be back in Connecticut before the FBI decides to freeze our assets. She dialed and the phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Cordelia, is it done, Preston? Ashford sounded exhausted. His voice was rough, stripped of the confident authority that had defined him for as long as Marin could remember. He sounded like a man who had been awake for days watching his empire crumble around him. Almost, Cordelia said. Marin wants to speak with you first. A long pause. Then cautiously, put her on. Cordelia handed the phone to Marin, who accepted it with trembling fingers. She raised it to her ear, and her father's voice filled her head. Marin, his tone was careful, guarded. Your mother tells me you've agreed to sign the documents. I have, Marin said softly, but I need to understand why, Dad. I need you to explain it to me. How could you do this? How could you steal grandfather's work and let him spend 30 years trying to prove it? Preston was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. You wouldn't understand, Marin. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. Everything was handed to you. The schools, the clothes, the opportunities. You have no idea what it takes to build something from nothing. Grandfather knew what it took. Marin said, he invented the technology. He did the work. All you did was steal it. I improved it. Preston's voice hardened. I took his half-baked concepts and turned them into a functional business. I built the infrastructure, hired the teams, secured the contracts. Without me, his precious patents would have gathered dust in some filing cabinet until they expired worthless. So you admit it. Marin's voice was steady now, all pretense of defeat forgotten. You admit that the original patents belonged to Silas Thornwood, that you forged his signature to claim them as your own, that you built Ashford Global Logistics on intellectual property that was never yours. I admit nothing, Preston snapped. I'm simply explaining that the situation is more complicated than your simplistic moral framework allows. It's not complicated at all, Dad, Marin said. Marin, you're a thief. Mom is your accomplice. And you've spent 30 years covering up your crimes while grandfather died alone in a crumbling house trying to get someone to believe the truth. On the other end of the line, Preston Ashford went very quiet. From behind her, Marin heard a sharp intake of breath. She turned to see Cordelia staring at her phone, her face draining of color. Marin, Cordelia whispered, "What have you done?" Marin smiled. It was not a warm expression. "While you were negotiating, I was planning." She held up her own phone, the screen bright in the snowy darkness. "This call isn't just between us and Dad. It's a three-way conference. Edmund Whitfield has been listening to every word." No. Cordelia lunged for the phone, but Marin stepped back, keeping it out of reach. "No, that's not possible. You couldn't have. I called him while you were walking up to the cabin," Marin said calmly. "He agreed to stay on the line as a witness. Every admission Dad just made, every word of this conversation, has been recorded and documented by the legal team at Whitfield Partners." From the phone speaker, Edmund Whitfield's deep voice emerged. "Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Ashford, this is Edmund Whitfield. I can confirm that I have heard and recorded this entire conversation, including Mr. Ashford's admission that the original patents belong to Silas Thornwood. My legal team is already preparing a supplemental report for the FBI." Cordelia's face twisted with fury. She spun toward Vincent. "Stop her! Get that phone!" Vincent started forward, but before he could take more than a step, a new sound cut through the night. Sirens, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights flickering through the trees, reflecting off the falling snow. Marin smiled wider. "I also called the local police about 20 minutes ago. Told them that 2 men had broken into my grandfather's property, assaulted me, and were now attempting to coerce me into signing fraudulent documents. They seemed very interested." Vincent froze his face, going pale. The sirens were very close now, the lights visible at the end of Lorraine's driveway. "You little..." He reached into his jacket, and for one terrifying moment, Marin thought he was going for a weapon. But before he could complete the motion, the front door of the cabin flew open, and Lorraine Beckett stepped onto the porch, her double-barreled shotgun leveled squarely at Vincent's chest. "Move another inch," Lorraine growled, "and I'll put you down like a rabid dog. Try me." Vincent's hand stopped. Slowly, carefully, he raised both arms above his head. The first police cruiser roared up the driveway, its lights painting the snow in alternating red and blue. Officers poured out weapons drawn, shouting commands. Vincent was thrown against the Mercedes and handcuffed within seconds. Cordelia, too stunned to resist, was taken into custody without a struggle. Marin watched it all from the porch of the cabin, Lorraine's warm presence at her shoulder. The snow continued to fall gentle now, coating the chaos in a layer of pristine white. Edmund Whitfield's voice crackled from the phone still clutched in her hand. "Ms. Ashford, are you still there? I'm here, Mr. Whitfield. The FBI will be in touch shortly. They'll want a full statement along with access to the original documents." His voice softened. "You did well, Ms. Ashford. Your grandfather would be proud." Marin looked out at the police cruisers, at her mother being helped into the back of one vehicle, at Vincent Caulfield being loaded into another. The empire that had been built on her grandfather's stolen work was finally irrevocably coming apart. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield," she said quietly, "for everything. Don't thank me. You did this yourself. I was just a witness." The line went dead. Maren stood in the snow for a long time watching the police process the scene, watching the life she had known dissolve into the winter night. When the last cruiser finally pulled away, carrying her mother toward a future of federal charges and criminal trials, she felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't joy, it wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was peace. Lorraine's weathered hand settled on her shoulder. "Come inside, girl. It's freezing out here, and there's nothing more you can do tonight." Maren nodded slowly, but she didn't move immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted iron key that had started everything. The key to her grandfather's house. The key to the truth. She held it up, letting it catch the light from the cabin windows. "I need to go back," she said softly. "To the house. There are still things I need to find. Things grandfather left for me." "Tomorrow," Lorraine said firmly. "Tonight you rest. You eat. You let yourself breathe. The house will still be there in the morning." Maren looked at the old woman, seeing for the first time the deep well of kindness beneath her gruff exterior. Lorraine Beckett had been her grandfather's friend, his confidant, his last ally in a decades-long battle against injustice. And now she was extending that same loyalty to his granddaughter. "Thank you, Lorraine," Maren's voice cracked. "For believing in me, for helping me, for not giving up on grandfather all those years." Lorraine's weathered face creased into something that was almost a smile. "Silas Thornwood was the finest man I ever knew. Standing by his memory was never a burden. It was an honor." She guided Maren back into the warm cabin and closed the door against the cold. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tire tracks and footprints, erasing the evidence of the night's confrontation. By morning, the world would be blanketed in white, clean and fresh, and new, a new beginning. The weeks that followed moved with the grinding inevitability of justice delayed, but finally delivered. 3 days after the confrontation at Lorraine's cabin, FBI agents arrived in Maine to take Maren's formal statement. She spent 8 hours in a small conference room at the local police station, recounting every detail of her 18th birthday, her discovery of the truth, her escape from the basement, and her final confrontation with her mother. The agents were professional but thorough, asking her to repeat certain parts of her story multiple times, probing for inconsistencies, verifying every claim against the documentary evidence she had provided. When they finally released her, the lead agent, a silver-haired woman named Director Morrison, had shaken her hand with what seemed like genuine respect. "What you did took courage, Ms. Ashford. Most people in your position would have taken the money and walked away." Maren had shaken her head. "It wasn't courage, it was necessity. I couldn't live with myself if I let them win." 1 week after the confrontation, federal agents executed simultaneous raids on the Ashford family's Connecticut estate and the headquarters of Ashford Global Logistics. Preston Ashford was arrested at his desk, still trying to shred documents, when the agents burst through the door. Cordelia, who had been released on bail after the incident in Maine, was taken into custody at a spa in New York City, where she had been hiding from the media firestorm. The charges were extensive: patent fraud, securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, money laundering. By the time the federal prosecutor finished reading the indictment, Preston and Cordelia Ashford were facing a combined total of over 100 years in prison. Vincent Caulfield, facing his own set of charges for assault, kidnapping, and conspiracy, had turned state's evidence within 48 hours of his arrest. His testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle, confirming that the Ashfords had known about the fraudulent patents from the beginning and had spent 30 years actively suppressing any investigation into their origins. The trial, when it finally came, was mercifully brief. Confronted with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of their own former lieutenant, Preston and Cordelia Ashford, entered guilty pleas to multiple federal charges. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who had clearly read every page of the court filings, delivered her sentence with cold precision. Preston Ashford received 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Cordelia Ashford received 18 years eligible for parole after 12. Maren did not attend the sentencing hearing. She had said everything she needed to say in her victim impact statement, a document that she had written and rewritten a dozen times before finally sending it to the prosecutor. She had described her grandfather's decades of suffering. She had described her own experience of being treated as a tool rather than a daughter. And she had asked the court to impose whatever sentence justice required without mercy, but also without cruelty. The day her parents were sentenced, Maren was in Maine, sitting in her grandfather's workshop, carefully reassembling one of the antique pocket watches that had been damaged during Vincent's raid. Lorraine had helped her clean the house during those first few weeks. They had swept away the dust and debris, repaired the broken windows, replaced the rotted floorboards on the porch. The work was slow and physical, and Maren found it strangely therapeutic. Every nail she hammered, every board she replaced felt like an act of restoration, not just for the house, but for her grandfather's memory. The letters arrived in late November. They were exactly where Lorraine had said they would be, in a fireproof box in the attic of her cabin. 43 sealed envelopes, each one dated and addressed to Maren Ashford in her grandfather's elegant handwriting. She had carried them back to the Victorian house and spent an entire week reading them one per day, savoring each word. The letters were everything Lorraine had promised. Her grandfather's thoughts, his memories, his advice for the life she would live after he was gone. He wrote about his childhood in rural Pennsylvania, about his early experiments with clockwork mechanisms, about the joy he had felt when he first held her as a newborn baby. He wrote about his regrets, the mistakes he had made, the people he had trusted who had betrayed him. And he wrote about his hopes for her future, the life he dreamed she would build once she was free from the shadow of her parents' corruption. The final letter was dated just 3 weeks before his death. His handwriting was shakier than in the earlier letters, the words sometimes difficult to read. But the message was clear. "My dearest Maren," he had written, "if you are reading this, then my plan worked. You have found the truth, and you have used it to set things right. I know the path was not easy. I know you suffered. But I also know that you are stronger than they ever gave you credit for. You are my granddaughter, my little bird, and you have proven that the Thornwood spirit cannot be broken. Whatever you do with your life from this moment forward, know that I am proud of you. Know that I love you, and know that somewhere, somehow, I am watching over you the way I always wished I could have done while I was alive. Build something beautiful, Maren. Build something true. And never let anyone steal your gears." With all my love forever and always, Grandfather Maren had cried for a long time after reading that letter. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of closure, of the profound relief that comes when a wound finally begins to heal. She had been given a gift. Not just the money in her grandfather's offshore account, not just the intellectual property that rightfully belonged to her, but something far more valuable. She had been given a second chance. 7 years later, Maren Ashford stood at the window of her corner office, gazing out at the Boston skyline as the sun set over the harbor. She was 25 years old now, and the frightened teenager who had fled Connecticut in a rusted Honda Civic felt like a stranger, a character from a story she had read long ago. The office belonged to Thornwood Innovations, the company she had founded 3 years after her parents' conviction. Using the $2 million her grandfather had left her, combined with the licensing fees from the patents that now bore his name, she had built something new, something clean, something that would have made Silas Thornwood proud. Thornwood Innovations specialized in precision engineering solutions for the logistics industry, the same field her grandfather had revolutionized 30 years ago. But where Preston Ashford had built his empire on theft and fraud, Maren had built hers on transparency and integrity. Every patent was properly attributed. Every inventor was fairly compensated. Every dollar of profit was earned honestly. The company had grown slowly at first, building its reputation one contract at a time. But word had spread about the young CEO with the famous family name and the famous family scandal, the woman who had brought down a corrupt empire and risen from its ashes. Investors who valued ethics over expedience had sought her out. Partners who had been burned by Ashford Global's fraudulent practices had given her a chance to prove that the Thornwood name could mean something different. Now, 7 years later, Thornwood Innovations employed over 300 people and had contracts with shipping companies across North America. The company wasn't a giant like Ashford Global had been, but it was solid, profitable, built on a foundation that would never crumble because it had nothing to hide. Ms. Ashford. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your car is ready. You asked me to remind you about your flight." "Thank you, Daniel." Maren turned from the window. "Tell the driver I'll be down in 5 minutes." She gathered her things quickly, a leather briefcase that had belonged to her grandfather, a wool coat that she had bought at a thrift store during her first winter of independence. Some habits were hard to break. Even now, with more money than she would ever need, she still caught herself checking price tags, still felt a twinge of guilt when she spent anything on herself. The drive to Logan Airport took 45 minutes in rush hour traffic. Marin spent the time reviewing reports on her tablet, approving budgets, responding to emails from clients and partners across the country. The work never stopped, but she wouldn't have had it any other way. Every hour she spent building Thornwood Innovations was an hour spent honoring her grandfather's legacy. The flight to Portland, Maine took just over an hour. A rental car was waiting for her at the airport, a modest sedan that she drove herself through the darkening countryside. She knew the route by heart now, having made this journey dozens of times over the past 7 years. North on I-295, east on Route 1, then onto the winding back roads that led to the coast. The Victorian house emerged from the trees just as the last light faded from the sky. It looked nothing like the crumbling wreck she had first encountered on that desperate October night 7 years ago. The ivy had been cleared, the paint refreshed the porch, rebuilt with sturdy new lumber. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and warm light spilled from every window. Marin parked in the circular driveway and stepped out into the cool evening air. The smell hit her immediately as salt water and pine needles, and something else, something that transported her back to her childhood. The smell of her grandfather's workshop. She walked around the side of the house past the restored flower beds and the newly planted apple trees to the small outbuilding that had once served as Silas Thornwood's sanctuary. The workshop had been painstakingly restored, every tool cleaned and oiled, every clock repaired and set running. She had spent countless hours here over the years, learning the craft that her grandfather had loved, finding peace in the precise manipulation of gears and springs. Tonight, though, she wasn't here to work. She was here to remember. Marin unlocked the workshop door and stepped inside. The familiar smell enveloped her brass polish and machine oil and dried lavender. She moved through the space without turning on the lights, navigating by memory and by the soft glow of the moon through the windows. The grandfather clock stood against the far wall exactly where it had always been. Its steady tick-tock filled the silence, a heartbeat that had been restored after decades of neglect. Marin placed her hand on the mahogany case, feeling the vibration of the mechanism within. "I did it, grandfather," she whispered. "I built something beautiful, something true." The clock continued its measured rhythm, indifferent to her words, but somehow comforting in its constancy. It would keep ticking long after she was gone, a monument to the man who had created it and the woman who had saved it. Marin reached up and pressed the hidden lever behind the decorative crest. The clock face swung open, revealing the compartment where her grandfather's journal had once been hidden. The space was empty now, the journal safely stored in a climate-controlled vault, along with all the other original documents. But she had placed something new inside. A photograph of herself and Silas taken during one of those precious childhood visits to Maine. She was maybe 8 years old in the picture, grinning up at her grandfather, while he showed her the inner workings of a mantel clock. His wild white hair was backlit by the workshop windows, and his weathered face was creased with joy. It was the only photograph she had of the two of them together, and it was worth more to her than all the money in the world. She closed the clock face and stepped back, letting the workshop settle into silence around her. There was one more thing she needed to do before she slept. The Thornwood Foundation had been her idea, born in the months after her parents' sentencing. It was a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting independent inventors who had been victimized by intellectual property theft, providing legal resources, expert witnesses, and financial assistance to help them fight for justice in a system that was often stacked against them. In its first 5 years of operation, the foundation had helped recover over $40 million in stolen royalties for inventors across the country. It had funded successful lawsuits against 3 major corporations, forcing them to properly credit and compensate the people whose ideas they had appropriated. And it had established a scholarship program for engineering students from disadvantaged backgrounds, ensuring that the next generation of inventors would have the education and resources they needed to protect their work. Tonight, Marin had received word that the Foundation's most recent case had been settled. A 67-year-old mechanical engineer named Harold Fisher, who had spent 20 years trying to prove that a major automotive company had stolen his fuel injection design, had finally received justice. The settlement was for $12 million, plus a formal acknowledgement of his contribution to the technology. Harold had called her personally to deliver the news, his voice breaking with emotion as he thanked her for believing in him when no one else would. Marin had told him the truth. She hadn't believed in him because she was kind or generous or particularly virtuous. She had believed in him because she knew exactly what it felt like to have your life's work stolen by people with more power and more money. She had believed in him because her grandfather had taught her that the truth matters even when the whole world is conspiring to bury it. She had believed in him because that was the only way to honor the memory of Silas Thornwood. Marin walked back to the main house and let herself in through the kitchen door. The interior was warm and welcoming, nothing like the dust-shrouded tomb she had first entered 7 years ago. She had filled the rooms with comfortable furniture, with books and artwork and photographs of the people she loved. Lorraine Beckett had a permanent room on the second floor, though she spent most of her time in her own cabin on the ridge, fiercely independent to the last. The letters from her grandfather were stored in a cedar chest in the master bedroom, carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves. She took one out now, selected at random, and settled into the armchair by the window to read it by the light of the moon. This letter was from when she was, 12 years old, written on the anniversary of the day he had first taught her to repair a broken pocket watch. "My dearest Marin," he had written, "today I am thinking about time. Not the abstract concept that philosophers debate, but the practical reality that clockmakers understand. Time moves in one direction only. We cannot go back and fix our mistakes. We cannot relive the moments we squandered or reclaim the opportunities we missed. But here is the secret that most people never learn. Time is not our enemy. It is our teacher. Every failure, every setback, every moment of pain, these are the lessons that time uses to shape us into who we are meant to become. The broken gear teaches the clockmaker patience. The rusted spring teaches him humility. The shattered crystal teaches him to be gentle with fragile things. You are so young, my little bird. You have so much time ahead of you. And I know that your parents are not the people they should be. I know that they see you as a tool rather than a treasure. I know that your childhood has been